Well, in case anyone hasn't noticed, the world slash especially this country in America is in a state of political disaster. And I think in a lot of practice circles, there is the question of how do we practice with this crisis? But I think that one question is actually two questions in one. And these two questions have very different answers. So let's go through them one by one. And I think the two questions are, how do I act as a force of good in this world that is so filled with darkness? And the other question is, how can I gaze upon this world on fire and not burn from moral outrage? Okay, so let's go over the force of goodness question first. How can we be forces of good in a world that is so filled with darkness? I think it's really important for people to consider their livelihood. Mm. I think in a lot of practice circles, we spend a lot of time talking about right view, which is amazing. Like we need to talk about right view. It's the foundation of practice. It is the first of the folds of the Noble Eightfold Path. And and right view and right livelihood is also so important. It is also one whole fold of the Noble Eightfold Path and takes up one spoke of the Dhamma wheel, just like right view, just like right mindfulness and right concentration. And speaking as someone who has not always had right livelihood, I mean, I worked briefly in the film industry, worked briefly in advertising agencies, and there's nothing wrong with entertainment inherently, but I was working on these projects that I just knew were not making the world a better place, and in fact would muddy the minds of the people who engaged with those movies. And it felt so awful. It felt like my skin was on fire. I could not have my heart rest when I was doing that for my livelihood. And also in the advertising agency. The agency was very good at advertising itself, so it professed to have all these high intentions, but actually, as someone working at the agency, I knew that it was as much driven by hatred and greed and delusion as any other place. And at the time, like I didn't really have a foundation of practice. It was about 12 years ago, and oh man, I really came to understand why people developed alcohol addictions and other addictions because just life is so awful. What we do for our livelihoods takes half of our waking hours, and if half of it is just spent doing not so great things for people and is putting out energy that confuses and deludes people further, it really takes a toll on the heart. Those professions did not last long. I left. Versus, going into livelihoods like teaching high school, working in mental health for a while. Now I do some work that resists climate crisis, and there are definitely stressful things about these jobs. Um, Very stressful, but at least my conscience was light. And in like the deepest way, even when I was very stressed about other things, at least in the deepest way, my heart could rest. So, yeah, I would encourage people who want to be a force for good to really consider, what do you do for your livelihood? If you work full time, that's half of your waking hours. And if it takes 10,000 hours to master something, then after 5 years of working full time at a job, doing whatever you do, you can master putting a lot of good energy into the world, or you can master putting not so good energy into the world. It makes such a big impact over the career of maybe 40, 50 years. Imagine how much of a difference that can make. It's like the one decision of what you do for your job has such an enormous impact over the course of a lifetime. So there's that. And if you have your livelihood right already, or if you're in the process of transitioning into a livelihood that will allow your heart to rest, then we can also join a cause. There are so many things we can do with our just 1 or 2 hours a week. And I know that sounds like a lot for people, but just 1 or 2 hours a week, join an organization. Whatever interest you have, you can find a way to put it toward doing good. Like when I was really interested in gardening for a while, I found an urban farm nearby. I was living in San Jose at the time, Taylor Street Farm, also called Garden to Table, SV, Silicon Valley. But they do such amazing work. They just have people come and volunteer 1 evening a week on their farm, and they do so much amazing work bringing food sovereignty to all the neighborhoods, to people of all different walks of life. And then for a while, I was really into music, so I joined a community choir, and so much of their proceeds goes to support the music department of a local high school. And yeah, whatever interest you have, you can find a way to put it to good use in the world. And in the meantime, it can be a lot of fun. I found such great community when I was there. I built really amazing friendships. And I think a lot of times when people think of volunteering or joining a cause, they maybe imagine something very dour, something very unpleasant, a chore. But it doesn't have to be that way. It can be just a lot of fun. Forming adult friendships doesn't have to be that hard. You just find an interest and you just show up consistently, and be yourself, and that's all you really have to do, in my experience. But I imagine some people listening to this might think that they do not have 1 or 2 hours a week. They do not have 1 or 2 hours a month to spare. And then for those people and for everybody else, I would really encourage people to just practice as well as they can in their relationships that already exist in their daily life, whether it's with your family or your friends, your colleagues. Every interaction we have with someone is a chance to love them. And I definitely have experience with just someone just dropping a comment. Maybe they don't even mean to teach me at the time. Sometimes they do. But like the right comment said at the right time when I was ready to hear it has changed my life before. I think one example I'll bring up is we were on pilgrimage, and this was at a time in my life when I was really curious and invested and in hearing every detail of whatever conversation was happening next to me. And even if I was watching TV, if I missed the tail end of what some actor was saying at the end of the line, I would feel the compulsion to rewind and just hear what everyone said. But then on pilgrimage, we were standing around and someone was laughing in the corner, and it was obviously some funny joke, I think. And someone turned to Ayachitananda and said, "Oh, what did they say?" And Ayachitananda just kind of shrugged and said, "I don't know. I don't think it's going to help me awaken, so I don't care." And it really struck me to hear that, like maybe I don't have to catch every word. And just hearing that comment really freed me from that compulsion. And I don't have to know every detail. It's it's either going to be helpful to my practice or it's not. And I feel like we can apply intuition to discerning a lot of the times whether it's helpful or not. And if it's helpful, then you can just let it pass. It can just be a fart in the wind. And I've really seen and heard and observed examples of just that really well-timed comment in just a daily interaction with someone you might see every day, but just one comment can change the course of someone's career, can really encourage someone to finally go talk to their boss and learn how to plan a trail or plan a path for a promotion. That changes the course of their life, changes the course of their spouse's life and their children's life. Or a really well-timed comment I've seen and witnessed can, finally have someone stop drinking. It would encourage them to go see a doctor, and the doctor would really tell them how important it is not to drink, take a break at least for a few months. And when they do, they finally experience the clarity of mind and the rest in the body when it's not stressed by alcohol all of the time. And they decide to stop drinking for life. And that is so beautiful. One comment can change the course of someone's life. And I'm sure anyone who's listening to this has also been that person who has said a comment who has changed the course of someone's life before. And I'm sure you've all experienced also how one comment from someone at the right time when you're ready to hear it can also change your life. And of course, I think the most important thing that we can possibly do to become more and more of a force for good in the world is to practice for ourselves and to practice for the sake of practice. Because if you want to see more wisdom in the world, if you want to teach wisdom to someone else, you need to have their consent, you need to have their buy-in, you need to have their heart and their mind open to you, at least a little bit. But your heart and mind can always be open to yourself and can always be open to your own practice. And you can always look around and really feel into how can I practice in this moment, deepen my practice. And if you do want to teach someone, if you do want to be a more powerful force for good for others, then, someone with a Swiss cheese mind can only ever be capable of imparting Swiss cheese wisdom to someone else, versus someone with a diamond mind can be capable of imparting diamond wisdom to others, and diamond compassion, diamond kindness, diamond generosity. And yeah, let's all shoot for it. Diamond caliber. And I definitely had the experience of receiving compassion from someone when it comes with a lot of sense of self. When someone's trying to fix me or someone is afraid of my suffering and they just want it to go away. And I remember that brand of compassion really just making things worse, to be honest. Versus the kind of compassion that is free from a sense of self. And that kind of compassion can wipe clean the slate of my suffering. If not in that very moment, then at least really catalyze my process of getting to that place. So yes, if we wish to be force for good in the world, then let's practice. And that would be my answer for that first part of the question, how do we practice in times of political disaster? That would be my answer to the question of how can we be a force for good? So the second half of that question is how can I gaze upon this world on fire and not burn from moral outrage? And I don't know what your path will be, so I will just tell you a few stories of my own path in finding the answers to this question. And yeah, I'll go back to that advertising agency again when I worked there about 12 years ago. It's 12 years. Time passes so fast, doesn't it? And so much can happen in 12 years. But at the time, I had no practice, no foundation, and I was a femme person of color in an agency and an industry that is dominated by men and dominated by white people. It was hard. Uh, and especially in this agency, I think that bullying and public humiliation were used as leadership strategies. And not just me, but a lot of women and whatever people of color there were had a really hard time. And we each had like our designated places to cry. So like one person had the HVAC room, one person had the stairwell, and when I needed to cry for moral outrage at the injustice that I was receiving and witnessing, I would excuse myself for a quick break and go onto the street, turn a couple corners, and just cry on the sidewalk. And sometimes not just cry, but scream and roar and hold up my middle fingers at the sidewalk. So there was a lot of moral outrage, not no foundation or practice, so just a lot of crying and screaming. Those were hard times. But anyway, Life happened. I left the advertising agency and I'll spare you all the details. It's kind of a long story. You can ask me if you want later. But I was shoved onto the spiritual path, wrestled onto the spiritual path, and then I had a little bit of a foundation of practice. And then I also started teaching at a high school. And again, at this particular high school, out of a staff of 100 teachers, there were about 10 teachers of color. And it was a Catholic school. So, there were certain attitudes about queerness that I don't agree with. And there were some teachers who were queer, but it was like at most an open secret that they were queer. And I was one of the very few teachers who came out and said, I am not straight. I am queer. I am, you know, yeah. I'm like queer 3 different ways. I'm pretty queer. But anyway, so naturally, I think a lot of students who faced a lot of injustices as students of color or queer students in a Catholic school would feel safe in my classroom and feel safe confiding in me, even if they were not really my students. They were not enrolled in my classes. And as I got to know these students and I got to know all the injustices they faced at this school, I felt the deep need to advocate for them. And I really felt my heart open with love because I was not willing to advocate for myself because advocating can be very, very scary. But because I really deeply loved my students, I decided I would advocate for them. And this was at a time in my life when I was very scared of authority. So I would go and talk to the administration, and my voice would be trembling, and I would have this huge build of adrenaline in my body. I would be shaking, like my legs would be shaking under the desk, and I would have to dig my fingernails into my skin in order to not shake any more violently than I already was, or not to cry in that moment. So it's really scary. Uh, these days, I don't give a crap about authority anymore, and I don't know. I'll talk to you and the director at work. I don't know, with like I am talking to anybody else. In fact, I would think I would talk to the custodian with more respect because they don't get paid enough to do what they do. But anyway, at that time, I was very scared. But because I loved my students so much, I really learned the power of taking action and not just advocating for my students as an adult, talking to other adults, but really coaching them because they were very excited to take action for themselves, to coaching them to also make a presentation, call a meeting with the vice principals, and you can also talk and you can also advocate for yourself. And that is probably out of my 3 years of teaching at that high school, one of my most proudest memories. And that's saying a lot because there were so many beautiful memories from that experience. And yeah, they totally kicked ass. They were amazing. And it's not just I really learned this then, it's not just what outcomes come out of advocating that matter, but just standing up and using our voices, even if nothing else came from it, even that was powerful and made a huge difference in ourselves. And I could definitely see in my students made a huge difference for them as well. And yeah, if you have a sense of moral outrage, also there is so much action, so much power in just taking action. Kyle and I went to a protest a couple weeks ago, and even if nothing else came from that protest, even just being there was so beautiful. And I just wept the entire time I was there because in a world where it may seem like if all you do is read headlines, it may seem like there is no justice in the world, there's no hope in the world. At that protest, there was so much hope and there was so much justice. Hope is what brought everybody there. Justice was chanted on everyone's lips, and it was so beautiful. Yeah, so get involved, do something. And then a few years later, I think I had a much stronger foundation of practice then. And at this time, I would say I had learned to see my suffering as a great teacher and see my suffering as a great friend to me. So I encountered another instance of moral outrage. This time I was working at a social emotional learning company, and the CEO and founder of this company is kind of like this rock star in the social emotional learning world, you know, travels the world and has conferences. And I have not gone to those conferences myself, thankfully, but I have heard from others who have at the company that the social emotional learning professionals and fans can get really wild and will corner her in the elevator, like crowds of people screaming her name, like she's that kind of famous, that kind of popular. Anyway, I was in the lunchroom one day just eating my lunch, and then this social emotional learning rock star came in and started talking to me and just said like all of these really transphobic things all in a row. And I'm like openly gender nonconforming, and that falls under the umbrella of trans identities. And for her to say that to me was a massive shock to me. And big time dukkha happened right then and there in my mind. And it took me, oh my gosh, many, many hours to unpack. But it was an amazing learning experience. And here's why. As I sat with the dukkha and I was like, okay, my great teacher dukkha, my great friend dukkha, let's rock and roll. Like, what are you going to teach me today? I sat with that suffering, and just as I sat with it, just all of these different layers of suffering fell away. And as an example, like one of the first layers of suffering, it was like this indignation that as an openly gender nonconforming person, somebody would just come and say all these really transphobic things right to my face. But as I sat with it, I realized that I don't know, like, do I want to be gender nonconforming in a way that just clings to gender in another way? Or am I gender nonconforming in the way that I think of gender for me as like an imaginary castle in the sky? Okay, so if it, however much you care about your gender is however much I care about your gender for you. Like, if you care very much about your gender, then of course I also treasure it and wish to protect it. For me, I think that my experience of gender is that it is just like an imaginary castle. So as I sat with the suffering that day, I realized that if someone comes up to my face and just says a bunch of things that are misgendering me, then it's like they think my imaginary castle is pink, when really the imaginary castle is glitter. But really, ultimately, it's an imaginary castle. So, like, who cares? So I was like, okay, cool. I reached that insight, and that layer of suffering fell away. But then there were just more and more layers. Like the next layer was, how can someone who is so highly regarded in the social emotional learning world be actually so ignorant in this way? And as I sat with it, I realized prestige, honor, regard are just, I don't know, like cardboard cutouts of people, and who they are can be quite different. And, I've met enough executives in my life to know that oftentimes they have no idea what's going on either. And they're just going around projecting an image of themselves, and everyone's just scared of that image. It's like that Plato's cave analogy, where there's a shadow on the wall, and you probably know the rest. Okay. And then there were many, many more layers. I don't remember all of them. And each time a layer fell away, I was like, okay, maybe this is the last one. And I know that I'm done with a particular instance of dukkha, and it has taught me everything it needs to teach me when there is just peace in the heart, or oftentimes there's a surge of gratitude, and it's a very pleasant feeling. And that's how I know I'm done. So all these layers are falling away, and each time I was like, is this the last one? And no, it wasn't. I had more to learn until finally I reached the center of that instance of dukkha, and I realized that I was actually angry at her because I was angry at myself. because all these memories were coming up of when I was a teacher and I loved my students so much, I think there's this particular brand of suffering and shame when the very person or people who you love so much and all you want is the best for them, and you would do anything you can do to protect them and do good for them and have them be just know that they're loved and not make any mistakes for them. When you love someone like that and you mess up real bad sometimes, oh, there's a particular kind of pain that goes with that since that experience. And there were just a couple of mistakes I had made in my teaching career that I was still angry at myself for. So, for example, I had misgendered a student when, when I was, just learning about other genders besides woman and man. And I think I saw in her face that it really hurt. I hadn't forgiven myself for that. And just, some other things like that. So I was like, okay, that's where my suffering is really coming from. I'm angry at myself. So do I dare sit with that anger and forgive myself? And I bet you can guess what the answer is. So I sat with that pain and I knew that I did the best that I could at the time. And because I knew how much I loved my students, I knew that if I knew any better at all in the time, I would have done better, of course. And I really think everybody is doing the best they can at the time with the resources they have. And if I was looking back and I was angry at myself, it's only because now I know better. Now I have more knowledge, and now I have much deeper practice than I did at the time. I have much more experience than I did at the time. So, of course, I would look back and think that I was so ignorant then. But at the time, I really didn't know better. I didn't have the experience. I didn't have the support. I didn't have the depth of practice. And I think that if any of those students, no matter how much I hurt them, if they felt in their heart and if they really asked themselves, like, did Ms. Lee mean to hurt me? I think they would know that the answer was no. I hope anyway. So I just had to be really tender to myself, and it was hard, you know. It was hard at the time, but I was able to forgive myself. And when I really forgave myself, then that is when I really fully, deeply, thoroughly forgave that person I was working for. And finally, I broke through to that well of deep peace and gratitude for the strength of my practice, gratitude for everyone who has taught me so that I can know better now. Gratitude even for the person I was working for, because she had created the conditions for me to learn a lot that day. And just, wish the best for her. May she do better next time. And it's not really none of my business if she does or doesn't, but may she do better. May I do better. May everybody do the best that they can at the time. And we already are. Okay, so learned a lot about moral outrage that day. Actually have to forgive myself. And then some time passed again, and then I experienced another surge of moral outrage one day. I think it was something in the headlines. And I was like, oh, goody, another chance to practice. So I brought it into meditation, and I was like, okay, like, what is this moral outrage teaching me today? And as I sat with it in meditation, I realized that there was an intellectual understanding that samsara is like this, but in my heart, deep in my heart, there was still this resistance, and there was still this sense of like, no, it should be better, the world should be better by now. And then as I really sat with that feeling and let it open up to me, and I really felt in my body that samsara is all conditioned things, isn't it? So sometimes samsara is dancing with my partner in the living room, and sometimes samsara is the wag of my dog's tail as I enter the house, and samsara is genocide. Samsara is sanctioned violence and murder. Samsara is horrific, not just unpleasant and uncomfortable and inconvenient, but horrific and gruesome and atrocious. And I let it not break my heart, but break my heart open and really look that ugly truth in the face, standing toe to toe with it, nose tip to nose tip. And ever since that day, I have personally not been touched again by moral outrage. It it makes my heart somber to see the headlines. It makes my heart heavy, but it doesn't make my heart singe. And I think, someone might hear this and think, oh, if samsara is truly like that all the time, which it is, and if we ever go through a period where we are not aware of genocide, then it is only because it has moved to a part of the world where we are less aware of that part of the world. Or it has moved from the headlines, the dukkha and the suffering and the greed, hatred, and delusion has moved from the headlines into the bedrooms of people's houses, the back rooms of people's offices. Just moves around. But anyway, someone might hear this and think, oh, but is there no hope? Is there no hope for the world? Well, this is the world, this is the state of the world. And we don't need hope to do good. In fact, it might be better if you don't need hope. You don't even look for hope, because hope is a needy fire. It requires a lot of fuel to keep it going. You have to be inspired all the time to keep hope going constantly. But we can just do good because that is the thing to do. And we can just love our family, friends, neighbors, all the people of the world because that is the thing to do. I don't think I don't think arahants give talks and teach people because they're like, "Ooh, I hope they get awakened today. I hope they get awakened today. I hope they get awakened." I don't think it's like that. I think they just do it because that is what practice calls them to do. That is what their goodness calls them to do. I don't I don't think they need hope. So, despite what's happening in samsara, we can just be good and do good because that is the thing to do. I once heard the question of like, how do you deal with like being a minority member in the world and seeing all the oppression of the dominant culture? And yeah, like I said before, like sometimes the heart does get very somber and quite heavy. But what really helps is knowing that no matter how many acts of oppression there are in the world on this planet, that my chitta is bigger than that. Because all of the acts in the world, like they are still finite. They're still limited to the things that people can do in the space-time continuum on this planet. But the chitta is infinite. Pure consciousness is infinite. And if you have been to the deeper jhanas yourself, maybe you have also experienced that consciousness is infinite. So there might seem like, and it does seem like, that there is a lot of violence and oppression in the world. But even the biggest number you could possibly think of, if you think of the biggest number you can and then spend the rest of your life just adding zeros to the end of it, so it becomes a bigger and bigger number, even that number compared to infinity is just a fart in the wind. And, I recognize there's a lot of privilege in being able to say that. There's a lot of privilege in being able to practice deeply in this life. And it's only because circumstances and people have really supported me. So I do wish to acknowledge that. Uh, and and pure consciousness is infinite. And we can get to a place in practice where no matter how much violence and oppression there is in the world, that pure consciousness, we can feel into that at any moment, that it's infinite. And that space is bliss. And knowing all of this doesn't doesn't hmm, doesn't stop me from doing the most good that I possibly can in the world. In fact, it has only made my efforts more potent. It just allows me to gaze upon this world on fire and not burn from moral outrage, and to move through that fire, move through the flames, and not burn with them. So that is how we can practice in these times and in all times. And may we practice well.
So there's thank you for this reflection. It's really rich and there's a lot of different aspects you touched on. And I'm thankfully feeling a lot of relief and settledness around livelihood and actions. And that is a huge relief. It's like a settling in the heart. Um, so the aspect of the talk that really struck me was the way that you're talking and you've talked about this. I've heard you talk about this multiple times, like the way that you work with your dukkha, the way that you're allowing the experience to be your teacher and really bringing that into the forefront. And I was reflecting on that as you're speaking, and I realized, I mean, I've been noticing this and curious about it, but I'm realizing that there's like a real way that I can just try to distract and get away from that, feeling. Um, Especially if it's a more vulnerable thing. And lately it's been shame, like some like more buried levels of things like you spoke about, like this regret of, potentially having hurt someone, even if it wasn't with intention. Um, and I can see how like that feeling comes up and then there's like a sense of I don't know what to do with this. I don't really, you spoke to like bringing it into your meditation. I would love to hear like mechanically how you do that or in what ways? Because I think what tends to happen for me is I either go into a lot of thinking and I like to think about Dhamma. So I'll like listen to a lot of Dhamma talks, think about the nature of the universe, reality, infinity, physics, quantums. Like I'll go into things that are kind of related, but it is an intellectual escape. Or I go into kind of like a numb and I'll like, watch recipe videos or, kind of zone out and it's sometimes like today I was able to like be with the feeling in such a way that I could like cry and like let the feelings come up. And then I really do have relief. And I help people do that for a living. Like I know what that's like, but it's so curious to me and interesting that there's like this hatch, this like escape hatch to get away from the dukkha instead of really letting it teach me. And I know that's happening and I know it's like reducing the amount of time that I could spend a lot more time meditating than I do, for example. You know, I actually have the luxury, like a huge privilege and luxury of time. So, yeah, I would just love to hear more on how you recommend really like letting that dukkha be a teacher.
Mm. I think first of all, mindfulness really helps of like just checking in once in a while. Like, am I watching recipe videos to numb, or am I doing it because I'm really looking for a recipe to nourish my body? Big difference, right? And then in terms of like, what does it really feel like to practice that? I think it really helps to tune into the body and to know what I'm doing. Like I am bowing to my suffering now.
Mm,
And I think it really helps to have done it enough so I know like this is going to help me and all the other ways of distracting me are just not, and it's prolonging my suffering. Um, and it's like, you know what humility feels like in the body.
mm,
So time to be humble.
mm.
And it's like a flavor of love too.
Mm.
Loving and letting go. One word. Loving and letting go of the suffering.
Yeah, thank you.
And like all the techniques that you teach your patients or all your people, right? Like all the things you teach them.